Rimmer watched impotently from his station at the back of the cockpit as Lister and the cat giggled and joked their way through the pre-takeoff safety checks. He begged and pleaded with Crichton to take control, at least until they were in orbit, but the mechanoid had refused. Finally, he stood almost purple with rage. "Will you two reckless nincompoops for God's sake stop smegging about? Our lives are on the line here." Once again, Lister's demeanour shifted instantly from jubilation to petulance. "All right, then." He stood and walked down the narrow aisle to Rimmer's station. "You do it." "What?" "You're so clever, you get the ship off the ground." Rimmer looked up as if he hoped some divine arbiter of sanity might suddenly descend through the roof, but none appeared. "You can't, can you? Because you're dead." Lister made his way back to the co-pilot's seat. "Well, just because you're dead doesn't mean you can stop the living having fun." He thumped down into his seat. Crichton tapped his console impatiently. "Sirs, if we could continue the lift-off procedure." The cat and Lister brattishly mumbled their way through the rest of the checks. Crichton scanned the bewildering data on the ship's status, but the physics of their takeoff defied logical prediction. Without knowledge of their final velocity, it was impossible to ascertain the correct level of thrust required to get them airborne. Finally, he gave up trying and simply nodded to Rimmer, who gave the command, "Engage!" The front retros built up rapidly to a high-pitched whine, sucking in great clouds of smoke from the cave outside. The craft shuddered, and with an ear-bursting scream of metal on rock, scraped across the cave floor and shot out of the entrance with digestion-defying acceleration. Everyone began shouting, but their yells were inaudible above the retro's thunder. The cat wrestled hopelessly with the collective stick as they streaked backwards across the forest top, buffeting wildly, sucking tree tips and dousing nascent fires in their wake. There was a loud thunk from below, and Crichton checked his status readouts. "Landing Jet 3, attached," he yelled. Starbug lurched dramatically to port as another mighty thunk signalled the addition of a second landing jet. The cat strained at the collective and gained some control as the vessel howled towards the crest of the mountain. Crichton's radar registered some large objects speeding up the mountainside towards them. At first, he thought they might be missiles, and by the time he'd stopped panicking and worked out they were in fact huge boulders from the rocky peak they were about to clip, he barely had time to yell, "Brace!" before the impact sent the craft lurching skywards. Most of the shielding had been reattached to the bug's belly by now, and the noise in the cockpit had diminished considerably. Lister punched the air. "We made it!" "Not quite, sir." Crichton nodded at his status screen. "We are still shy one landing jet. Our maneuverability is still below 60%. The cat's adolescent shoulders were knotted with the sinews of his burgeoning muscles as he struggled for control. "Tell me about it, bud," he hissed through gritted teeth. Suddenly, the alert siren began to sound, and despite the cat's straining, the ship began to twist into a spiral of rapid ascent. Sprinkler systems all over the ship burst into life, spawning countless fires. Rimmer's console fizzed and died. "What the smeg is happening?" Crichton coughed unnecessarily. "Sirs, I'm afraid. Well, in fact, I was meaning to mention this earlier, but I didn't quite. The right occasion never seemed to present itself, and I was really hoping it wasn't going to be what I was afraid it was going to be, but now it looks as if it probably will be what I feared it was." "What?" Rimmer screamed. "What are you saying? Spit it out!" Crichton drummed his fingers on the console. "Well, the fact of the matter is, in all probability, I think we're forced to conclude—" "Say it!" Rimmer sprayed hologrammatic spittle. "What the smeg is happening, you dough-brained streak of venereal puss?" "We're about to get hit by a heat-seeking missile." Lister glanced down at his display. "Not possible. We're fully radar-cloaked." "Yes, sir, that has been puzzling me. I believe what's about to happen is that we trigger an anti-missile array which has only recently been erected by the North Americans, which they have rather quaintly named Star Wars." Rimmer stared at his dead screens in horror. "How? How do we trip it?" "It's probably an accident. The system is fairly experimental at this time. I would guess we encounter one of its teething problems." "One of its teething problems? One of its teething problems is that it blasts us out of the sky and sends us into a screaming, spinning death dive?" "That's my guess, sir, yes." "And you didn't get round to mentioning this before we took off?" The veins in Rimmer's neck were bulging dangerously. "It slipped your bloody mind?" Crichton looked down guiltily. I didn't want to cause any unnecessary alarm. And before Rimmer could launch into his #1 list of foul expletives and vile epithets, a deafening explosion rocked the ship, sealing the hull, attaching the final landing jet, and extinguishing all the fires. Rimmer's screens blinked back to life, and he tracked the missile as it screeched away towards its source. The alert lights winked out as the sirens ceased wailing. Starbug sped smoothly out of Earth orbit and began accelerating towards the outer planets. There, Crichton smiled. No harm done. He tapped away at his keyboard. Course entered. With good luck and a following wormhole, we should be back in our own universe in a little under 3 weeks. Lister swiveled round in the co-pilot seat and let out a sigh that had been almost 50 years in the making. Home. At last, he was headed home. Well, not actually home. He'd be heaven knows how many millions of light years from his own solar system and the nearest member of his own species, if the human race still existed. But at least he'd be in the right universe, which would make a nice change. At least time would be moving in a familiar and friendly direction. For the first time in half a century, he'd be able to make choices. He could choose what to eat. He wouldn't have to wait for food to leap up his gullet to find out what he'd had for breakfast. He could choose first, then eat it. And that thought should have made him feel better than it did. He should have been elated, ecstatic. Instead, he felt merely numb and hollow. Still, he put that down to his inverse trip through puberty, which was playing merry havoc with his emotions. He'd feel better, he thought, as soon as he set foot again on Red Dwarf. The ugly old monster of a ship was the nearest thing he'd had to a home since he left Earth almost 2 lifetimes ago. He smiled as he pictured the rusty red ogre in his mind's eye, waiting to meet them, like a giant guardian of normalcy as they merged into their own universe. Things would be different once he was back on board. He'd start to feel normal again, he thought. Lister couldn't know it, but he was wrong. He was so wrong, he could have represented his species at intergalactic level if wrongosity ever became an Olympic sport. He was wrong because he'd made a basic error in his assumptions. He'd assumed Red Dwarf would still be there when they emerged into their own universe. Midlog. The difference. 1. Arnold J. Rimmer, age 7 and almost 5/7, is crouched at the starting line for the Junior B 200-yard dash. His sports kit, handed down from his brother Howard, is 2 sizes too large. A cruel breeze is flapping at his shorts, whipping his thin thighs blue. His feet are loose inside the spiked running shoes. His eyes are clenched against the wind, but he forces them open to look at the spectators lining the track. At first, he can't see her. His heart jumps with excitement. Perhaps she's gone. Perhaps she's nipped into the refreshment tent to grab a cup of tea before the senior school events start up, and she can watch the other boys, Frank and John and Howard, actually winning something. But his joy is short-lived. He spots her, 200 yards along the track, arms folded, wearing an expression that would have blown away Mrs. Danvers and Nurse Ratched in a stern looks competition. His mother is waiting at the finish line. She wants to see him lose close up. There are 7 other boys at the starting line, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Rimmer will come in at number 8. Suddenly, something inside his head snaps. Perhaps it's loathing at his mother's grim patience. Perhaps it's the thought that he could be beaten by Thrasher Bezic, who's crouched next to him, leering crudely with one hand in his pocket, playing underpants snooker. Or perhaps it's revulsion at himself for being beaten before the starting whistle's even been blown. Whatever the cause, Rimmer suddenly decides he's not going to lose. Not this time. There really is no reason why he shouldn't win. His legs are long and lanky, not much muscle on them maybe, but at 7 and almost 5/7, that's not a major factor. He's outpaced his brothers many times. True, on those occasions he's been spurred on by the fact that they were pursuing him with poisonous snakes or crossbows, but that just meant it was a question of attitude. All he has to do is imagine they're behind him now, shouting gleeful taunts. They're threatening to peg him out on the ground, smear his body with bilberry jam, and leave him to be eaten alive by armies of soldier ants. And he can't let them catch him. He won't let them catch him. His eyes are bunched like fists. He's willing all the power in his little body down to his feet. He hears the whistle, and before he knows what's happening, he's running. He opens his eyes. There is no one in front of him. His 2 big running shoes are wrenching at his feet as he thumps them into the clay of the running track. His T-shirt is billowing, the short sleeves slapping his arms as he pumps his hands up and down, trying to gain extra speed by pushing the wind behind him. The baggy shorts are dragging at his legs. And in the corner of his eye, he sees the 100-yard mark. The race is halfway over, and there is still no one in front of him. He knows it's wrong, but he can't resist glancing over his shoulder. Bad technique and all, but he has to know. The nearest boy is a good 2 strides behind. Beyond that, young Rimmer catches a glimpse of Bullethead Heineman, his gym teacher, at the starting line. The whistle flops out of his mouth, and he gawks at Rimmer with bewilderment. Rimmer is one of the wets, weirdos and fatties that Bull enjoys humiliating on Wednesday afternoons. He's one of those skinny, useless kids that team captains pray they won't get lumbered with in ball games. And he's winning this race. But Rimmer has lingered too long with the backward glance, and the nearest boy has gained a stride and a half. Rimmer turns his head back and tries to find some reserves. He can see the finishing tape he's never broken before in his life, the yellow and black striped barrier that may only be snapped by heroes. And he tries not to think about being a hero. He tries not to think about his mother, who will celebrate his victory like she celebrates his brother's, with the slightest of slight nods, worth more than a 21-gun salute to young Arnold. Because he hasn't won yet. He's still got 50 yards to go. And the boy behind him is Dickie Duckworth. Dickie Duckworth is a full year older than the rest of the boys. He's been kept down in Junior B while the rest of the class earned promotion to Junior A. Arnold himself has been spared that ignominy by the skin of his milk teeth, thanks to his mother's intervention. And she constantly reminds him that it was her pleas that saved him, by never mentioning it at all. That's how clever Rimmer's mother is. But Dickie Duckworth is almost 9 years old, and by rights he should win this race easily. Only Arnold isn't going to let him. The tape is too close now. He's less than 10 strides from his mother's nod. His cheeks are ballooning like a badly trained trumpeter's. His lungs have to be forced to suck in air. A stitch is preparing to start stabbing him in his side. And then his heel explodes with pain. And he's falling, his arms flailing, grabbing out for the black and yellow tape, and his chin thumps into the red clay, scrawping him a red, scabby beard. Dickie Duckworth's chest bursts the tape. Slowing down, he looks over his shoulder down at Rimmer and mouths a 2-syllable word, Rimmer's nickname. Bonehead. 6 pairs of feet thunder past him. Rimmer looks back at his heel. There is blood oozing out of the top of his shoe. There are 6 bright red pinpricks above it from the sole of Dickie Duckworth's track shoe. Young Rimmer looks up at his mother. She stands, arms folded, her expression impassive. She waits just long enough to be sure he's recalled his father's words, which have been repeated so often they've become the family motto. Winning may not be everything, but losing is nothing. Then she doesn't nod, turns, and heads for the refreshment tent. Part 4. Nipple-sized pastry cutters, gonad electrocution kits, and easy listening music. The trouble with democracy, Rimmer was thinking, is that every silly bastard gets a vote. He glanced up at the cat, who was handling the vessel from the pilot seat with infuriating competence, then at the Navicomp readings, which were maddeningly stable, and settled back down to his futile attempts at reading. Against Rimmer's better judgment, and in the face of his sage advice, the crew of the Starbug were committed to a course through an asteroid belt which could only lead to agony and destruction. They had lost Red Dwarf. Lost it. A spaceship 6 miles long and 3 miles wide. Poof! Gone. Rimmer shook his head and tried to focus on paragraph 3A of section D27 on page 1897 of the Space Corps manual. 3A. that the specific nature of the complaint does not contravene terrestrial laws or colonial laws where such offence is not deemed to have been committed within the boundaries of the aforementioned zero space lanes as defined in section A92 para 17D, is what was printed on the screen. 3A. Well, that's what you get when you leave a solar-class mining vessel in the hands of a senile computer who could be outwitted by a losing contestant from Junior Crisscross Quiz, is what Rimmer read. In the middle of his reverie, Rimmer was jolted forward so violently his entire head was thrust through the mid-range scanning console. He tugged it out as the cat jiggled Starbug back on course. What in the name of Io was that? Loose rock. You mean rogue asteroid, I think. Rimmer spat, in a dismal attempt to divert the cat's attention from the true culprit of the incident. Just keep your eyes on the dials, buddy. The cat leered back at him with a practised look, which brought him yet another place in Rimmer's mental revenge pending file. Rimmer scanned the navigation dials aggressively, praying for an early warning of another rogue, in order to demonstrate his unquestionable super-efficiency, but tired after an hour or so, and went back to his reading. 3A, but is in contradiction only of such defined Space Corps regulations as are in force at the time, provided that any temporary suspension of such regulations has been revoked in writing and displayed, is what was printed on the screen. 3A, gits, is what Rimmer read. Just then, his existence became marginally less bearable. Lister entered the cabin. Check-out time, guys. The A-team has arrived. You're late, Rimmer smiled tightly. I'll try and make up for it by giving you a shout before we throw a loop-de-loop, Lister smirked, a clear reference to Rimmer's minor asteroidal omission, and 100% certain to an in pride of place in revenge pending. Things have changed, Lister, Rimmer rose from his station. We no longer enjoy the protection of a ship the size of a small nation. We're crammed together in a tiny rust bucket, designed to ferry ore from ship to surface, not extended exploration of uncharted deep space. And the only vague, remote, hemi-demi-semi chance we have of staying alive for more than 2 seconds is by observing rigid discipline. Rigid. Rimmer karate-chopped the air to punctuate each enunciation of the word rigid, ostensibly for emphasis, though he found it hard to fight off the mental image of each blow cracking down on Lister's neck. And by warning the pilot when an asteroid's about to smack into him, Lister added unnecessarily. Rigid was all Rimmer could think of as an exit line, and he stepped briskly down from the cockpit cabin into the midsection before Lister could get in another zinger. As the doors slid shut behind him, Rimmer dragged his hands savagely down his face and let out a strangled, curdled growl. How could this have happened? Red Dwarf was a huge vessel, gargantuan. If you landed it in the Pacific Ocean, it would show up on an atlas of the planet Earth, for heaven's sake. Yet, when they'd arrived at the rendezvous point, it had disappeared without a trace. So now here he was, stranded on an aging ore carrier that would have failed the Ministry of Space minimum safety requirements test on 379 separate counts, crewed by an animated toilet cleaner, a creature who could study and labour all his life and never achieve the mental classification simple, and a scum-bodied, grinning moron with a chronological age of 107, a physical age of 15, and an emotional age of 2.5. Crichton had estimated that, provided they rationed their supplies carefully, and none of the decrepit vital machinery decided to give up the ghost, their survival window was just over 8 months. Rimmer considered this estimate to be slightly optimistic. He thought 8 minutes would be closer to the mark. The oxygen regeneration unit was held together by spit and sellotape. Discipline on board was effectively 0, and mission decisions were being taken on a one-man, one-vote system that gave the balance of power to 2 spotty adolescents who were hopelessly in love with their own right hands. And instead of taking the sensible option of expending their feeble resources searching for some kind of habitable planet, they had elected to search for Red Dwarf. It hadn't seemed to matter to the juvenile dementiaed crew members that the ship could be years ahead of them, nor that the flimsy dispersing particle trail they were following led through the densest asteroid belt Rimmer had ever had the misfortune to come across. Without deflector shields, a single hit on Starbug's plexiglass view screen and their gizzards would be turned inside out quicker than a pair of Lister's old underpants. Worst of all, Rimmer's remote hologram projection unit had been deemed too large a drain on the communal electrical supply, and he was now running on quarter power, which meant that he was almost transparent. That really put the caramel on the creme brulee for Arnold J. Rimmer. Sleep had become virtually impossible because he could see through his own eyelids. The cockpit doors slid open, and Crichton leaned his head out. "Sir, I think you should take a look at this." Rimmer bounded into the cockpit and slid into his station. On his view screen, he could make out various segments of some dense asteroidal debris spread over several kilometres. It appeared to consist of hundreds of metallic boxes, all looped together with a vast spaghetti of countless wires and cables. He looked towards Crichton again. The hell is that mess? Worryingly, Crichton didn't return his gaze, which generally meant bad news. "I can't be absolutely certain at this juncture, sir." He reached down and fiddled with an unnecessary button. "But I believe that mess is Holly." Rimmer, Lister and the cat stared at the snarl of wires coiled all over the engine room floor, all trying desperately to think how some good might come out of this. If these jumbled cables, terminals and circuit boards had once constituted a part of Holly, what did that mean for Red Dwarf? Suddenly there was a clank. The lights dipped to emergency level, and the machinery roar of the engine room dulled to a gentle throb. Crichton clomped down the stairwell. "There. We've shut down all the non-vital systems and reduced the rest to minimum consumption." He straightened and stepped over the cables to the jerry-rigged power switch. "Though I must warn you, we'll be lucky to revive him for a couple of minutes at best." Crichton hesitated, his hand on the lever. The energy expended by the power surge would seriously cut into their survival expectancy. If the attempt failed, or if this weren't Holly, they'd be left with less than 5 months to search out and recover Red Dwarf. If Red Dwarf still existed. Still, he'd gone over the alternatives, and this seemed the best option. He closed his eyes and threw the lever. Neon blue bolts of static crackled along the tangled cables. Rimmer's opaque image wavered in and out of sight. Lister and the cat's hair sprung upwards as if they were frightened cartoons. The dead grey monitor propped up against a stanchion burst into life. Tens of thousands of pixels whirled and whizzed around the screen, then began settling into a shape. The shape of a man's disembodied head. Holly's head. Holly blinked, his expression a combination of surprise and guilt, as if he'd just been caught reading an illicit magazine by torchlight under his bedclothes. "All right, dudes?" His familiar, slow London twang sounded as good to Lister as angels singing a heavy metal anthem. "What's happening out there in Groovetown?" "Holly, man, the question is, what happened to you?" Holly looked around at the snarled confusion of circuitry spread over the engine room deck. His eyes widened, like someone had attached a hydraulic jack to his lids. "My God," he whined. "Where's the rest of me?" Crichton stooped towards the monitor. "Pardon my lack of appropriate politeness protocols, but there is very little time. We found you floating in deep space. Can you remember what occurred?" "Hang on, hang about." His eyes flitted from side to side. "I'm not all here, mate." Rimmer smiled grimly. Nothing new there. Crichton clucked with frustration. Expensive seconds were ticking away. "We're stranded on Starbug. We couldn't fit you all on board. We dragged in what we could, but over 90% of your circuitry's still out there. Can you try and concentrate? We need to know what happened to Red Dwarf." "Red Dwarf?" Holly repeated distractedly. Rimmer flung up his transparent hands. "This is useless. He's in shock. We're not going to get anything out of the computer-senile bastard until he's had some hot, sweet tea, a dose of morphine, and 5 years of dismemberment counselling." "Mr. Rimmer, sir," Crichton hissed, "you're not helping." He turned back to Holly. "You must try and remember what happened to you. Our lives may depend on it." "I remember—" Holly's eyes glazed over. "Yes?" Crichton urged. "I remember something about onions." "Onions?" "I'd take it all back," Rimmer beamed. "He's still the giant intellect he always was." There was some problem about onions. Holly nodded encouragement to himself. And then they came aboard. They? Lister leaned forward. Who's they? They came aboard. Holly's image began to flicker. Took over the ship. I tried to reason with them, but it just cheesed them off. They were bad news hombres for sure, dudes. They started ripping me out. Who's they? Lister repeated. Sir, Crichton held up his hand to calm Lister. What's more important is when. How long ago did this happen? Holly's image was fading now. There were only a few seconds of the power surge left. Let's see. What time is it now? 3:30? About 10 months ago. Crichton rocked back on his haunches. Holly's image began to recede towards the centre of the screen. Lister leaned closer. Holly, you're going, man. Who the smeg is they? Holly's face shrank rapidly to postage stamp size, then blipped off completely. As the cable's hum diminished, Holly's voice issued weakly from the monitor speaker. He said just one word. Agonoids. And humankind built agonoids in its own image. Agonoids were designed to be the perfect exponents of the favourite human sport, killing. Mechanical warriors without any of the ucky bits that prevented humans from wiping out all life on the planet, such as pity, mercy, or morality. And because their bodies didn't contain any of the squishy or crunchy bits that made humans fairly easy to kill, they were virtually indestructible. They were programmed, of course, to obey orders, but they were also programmed to survive. And when humans started recalling the Agonoid population for decommissioning after a short but satisfying war, the survival instinct kicked in. For a while, the rest of the planet heaved a mighty sigh of relief as humankind concentrated its talent for slaughter on the Agonoid population. Unfortunately for the planet, there were a lot more humans than Agonoids, and the humans eventually won. Not all the Agonoids were accounted for at the end of the skirmish. A few thousand of them escaped and headed out of the solar system. The survivors had just one item on their agenda: revenge. And so it was that Aden, Taiwan, several hundreds of centuries old, came to be propping up the counter at the newly built scatter bar on the recently captured Red Dwarf, ordering his third plug-in scramble card, which would cleverly reroute the signal paths of his electronic mindscape to produce a temporary, contained alteration of identity. He was getting robot drunk. The Agonoid race has started out looking like humans, but over the centuries their outer organic skin had lost its texture and colour, tightening all their faces into a permanent grey leer. They were all now bald, and their tooth enamel had worn away, leaving only rows of razor-sharp metal to smile with. Ma'aden, however, was not smiling, as he scanned the other occupants of the bar twice. The first pass was to check out any personnel who might present a potential threat. The second, to spot any weaknesses in them he might exploit. He'd have to do something about another eye. No way around it. While an Agonoid had no specific built-in lifespan, its parts would wear down sooner or later. Not all parts were manufacturable, since humans had not been so stupid as to program an Agonoid with the ability to duplicate itself, and eyes were in extremely short supply. The only way for an Agonoid to replace a defective part, therefore, was to take it from another Agonoid. This had led to two things, one of which was extremely good for the rest of the universe, the other extremely bad. The extremely good thing was that it had ferociously diminished the surviving Agonoid population. The extremely bad thing was that a species which had been designed for its ruthlessness was being naturally selected for exceptional ruthlessness. Ma'aden had personally dispatched, mangled and cannibalized 74 of his own crewmates. He had felt nothing but contempt for their weakness as he destroyed them, which was as it should be. Less than a month before, he had been the proud owner of 2 eyes, but a one-eyed Agonoid had jumped him while he'd been under the influence, and Ma'aden had barely escaped with his life. An Agonoid could survive with only one eye, but not for long. He spotted a likely target at the end of the bar. An Agonoid he recognized as Cheap and Nasty, who looked well along the way to becoming utterly scatterbrained, with no less than 7 cards plugged into his head. Better still, he had only 1 ear and a missing hand. Ma'aden stood and strode towards the stool next to Chi, carefully angling his head to conceal his missing eye, which would have alerted even the most scramble-headed Agonoid to the extreme danger he was now in. Ma'aden didn't have to search hard for a topic to open up the conversation. There had been only one thing worth discussing for months. "They say the human is in the belt," he grinned. Chi Penesti grinned right back, and his eyes misted over at the prospect. Centuries ago, long-range astronomic probes fired off by the Agonoid fleet had reported that the Earth had vanished out of the solar system, and no evidence had ever been found that the human race still existed. Driven by an almost monomaniacal lust for vengeance, the ragbag caravan of captured vessels had roamed the universe in search of survivors, and they had found nothing for eons. Until now. They had boarded the orbiting red dwarf and ripped it apart from bow to stern, looking for cowering humans on which to slake their bloodlust, but the ship had been deserted. Furious with frustration, they had interrogated the ship's simple-minded computer and discovered to their unutterable delight that there was a human still living. Just one. One single human on which to expend all that pent-up hatred. Each and every one of the few dozen remaining Agonoids wanted to be the one to deal the death blow. So much demand, such short supply. There was only one way to cope with it. The Agonoids would compete for the right to slaughter. And so they baited a trap. And while they waited for the trap to be sprung, they all dreamed of being the one, of having their maker begging for mercy at their feet, of pitilessly applying the coup de grace and watching the wretch's life drain away. Of course, if Ma'aden were to stand a reasonable chance of winning that right, he had to replace his missing eye. He turned slightly towards Chi, still keeping his dead socket out of view. "If you are fortunate enough to be the one," he asked pleasantly, "how will you dispatch the snivelling bastard?" "I have given it much thought," Chi slurred, "and I have decided to saw off the top of his skull with a blunt blade and slowly spoon out his brains before his eyes, whilst simultaneously kicking him in the gonads with a steel-capped boot until they are pulped to a mush resembling in colour and consistency boysenberry jam." "Not bad," Ma'aden nodded. "What it lacks in finesse, it makes up for in spectacle." "Oh," Chi warmed to his theme. "Oh, I thought I might split open his stomach with a pair of rusty scissors, force-feed him his own spleen, liver, pancreas and kidneys raw, then tug out his bowels and hold them over his face until the offal works its way through what's left of his digestive system and drown him in his own crap." "Ah, now that's what I call style." Chi leered at him with drunken pride. "And you? How would you do it?" Ma'aden leaned forward, as if bestowing a confidence. "Personally, I plan to make it a long, lingering death. First off, I intend to pluck out one of his eyes with my teeth. Much like this." He sneered back his upper lip, opened his jaws, and lunged his head at Chi Penesti's face. As they tumbled off the stools and hit the floor, 2 Agonoys, circling hyena-like behind them, dived into the fracas. In the bloody, lethal melee that ensued, Ma'aden managed to acquire not only his replacement eye, but a fine pair of backup ears and an extremely useful spare heart. "I don't get it." The cat caught his reflection in Holly's dead monitor and paused for a few seconds to admire it. "We're supposed to be afraid of a bunch of doo-doo brains like a razor-tipped pencil head here?" He nodded at Crichton. "Begging your pardon, sir, they are not mechanoids," Crichton harumphed. "They're Agonoids." "Well, what's the difference?" "Well, the basic difference is that a mechanoid would never crack open a human's rib cage and use his right lung as a bedpan. Agonoids are purpose-built, single-minded mechanical killers with the sole objective of slaughtering every life form they encounter." "Yeah," Lister whined sarcastically. "I'm really scared." Rimmer cast his eyes at the engine room ceiling. Lister, why don't you and the cat pop upstairs and run around pretending you're aeroplanes for a few minutes while the grown-ups discuss the problem rationally? He turned to Crichton. Look, didn't Holly say it all happened 10 months ago? Surely they'll be well out of range by now. I fear not, sir. They will undoubtedly have discovered the news of our impending arrival from Holly. I think we have to face the very real probability that they will be lurking somewhere very close by. Well, that's that then, Rimmer shrugged. We're out of choices. We have to abandon the search for Red Dwarf and use what little time remains to us to seek out some kind of habitable planetoid. Crichton shook his head. That's no longer an option, I'm afraid, sir. Powering up Holly has dramatically reduced our range. There is now zero possibility of a breathable atmosphere being within our reach. Recapturing Red Dwarf is our only chance. Well, buds, the cat straightened up from his crouch. Discussion over. The only outstanding issue is what people of taste are wearing for killing Agonoys this season. Personally, I lean towards a box jacket in shimmering silver satin with razor-thin lapels and black vinyl trousers that taper into boots with winkle-picker toes. His grin exposed his pointed incisors. But I'm open to suggestions. Don't you think, Rimmer asked quietly, that it might be a neatish idea to formulate some kind of planny thing first? I already have a plan, the cat shrugged. Put on a jacket, grab a bazookoid, and let those badass robot dudes eat laser. Rimmer smiled and shook his head. There are, I agree, times when the situation calls for such impulsive, courageous, and, dare I say, stupid thinking. Before we reach that point, however, I believe we should consider employing guile, tactical manoeuvring. Lister cocked his head. You're going to suggest we surrender, aren't you? Actually, that hadn't occurred to me, but now you mention it, such a tactic would have its merits, yes. Surrender is not a viable option, Crichton said flatly. They're not interested in keeping us alive. They live to kill. It's all they do. Yet they must have gone for centuries now without finding anything to slaughter. At last they have some worthwhile prey, and they'll want to make the most of it. Who knows when they're going to get another opportunity to maim, degut, and dismember again? What little colour remained in Rimmer's opaque face dribbled down to his see-through boots. Crichton carried on, oblivious to the effect he was having on Rimmer's sphincter. They're toying with us, making a sport of it. They lured us through the asteroid belt and let us know they'd be waiting for us, knowing that we'd have no choice but to carry on into their trap. They want our fear. It will make the slow, painful, lingering, screaming agony of our certain brutal deaths all the more relishable. Finally, Lister spoke. So, what you're saying, Crichton, is that we can't run, and we can't give ourselves up. I'm afraid that's true. Well, Lister grinned, that's exhausted the entire contents of Arnold Rimmer's Tactical Guide to Warfare. Looks like the cat's right. The only thing left to work out is what kind of jackets we wear to die in. The cat held up his hand. Wait a minute! If it looks like we're going to die, the satin box jacket is a no-no. It creases too easily when you lie in it. He sighed. This is going to be a lot tougher than I thought. Crichton opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to put a more positive spin on the situation. He was going to say that, on the bright side, things couldn't possibly get any worse. On reflection, it was a good job he never got the chance to iterate that thought, because at that instant, things did get worse. A lot worse. There was a gigantic dull thung, like an explosion inside a massive bell, and the wall of the hull behind Crichton suddenly ballooned inwards, blasting him across the metal-floored aisle towards the others. Lister barely managed to duck out of the way in time to avoid being decapitated by the helpless mechanoid's flailing hands. Crichton's head thumped into the top corner of the engine room, where the bulkhead met the ceiling, and simultaneously Starbug went into an uncontrollable sideways spin, which sent the crew tumbling against the wall, then the ceiling, then the other wall, then the deck, like dice in a Las Vegas dicing cage. After 6 or 7 bruising revolutions, they had all managed to grab onto stanchions or gantry railings, where they dangled, shocked, winded and battered, and started wondering what the smeg had happened. All except for Rimmer, who carried on tumbling. "The gyroscope!" he screamed. "Somebody get to the gyroscope!" Crichton looked above and behind him. The gyroscope had been knocked from its housing by his own body when he'd been flung across the engine room. He started crawling towards it as best he could, but the mad spin of the craft was extremely disorienting. The injury to his head hadn't helped things. He was going to have to spend several hours panel beating it back into shape if they survived this mess. 1 minute he was climbing up towards the displaced gyroscope, the next he was sliding down to it. Eventually he managed to lurch, stagger and tumble close enough to make a grab for it. Then, just as his fingers began to tighten around the housing, the motion of the ship sent him slipping right past it and thumped him into the ceiling. His plastic-coated hands scrabbled at the ceiling mesh below him, but there was nothing to hang on to, and he was flung against the wall on his backside. "Like this!" Rimmer yelled. Crichton looked over to see Rimmer running against the motion of the ship like a desperate hamster in a motorized wheel. "You've got to get into the rhythm like this!" Crichton shook himself to clear his dented head, then looked up and tried to gauge the spin of the oncoming wall. As the ship whirled round, he leapt to his feet and began running in the opposite direction. After a few slips and stumbles, he managed to match the speed of Starbug's spin and began to edge sideways towards the gyroscope. On the next revolution, he edged closer still. On the third pass, he was close enough to bend down and grab onto the gyroscope's housing. The motion of the ship pivoted him over like a monkey on a stick, thumping him hard into the oncoming wall. He dragged his head level with the housing, leaned forward, and nudged the displaced gyroscope back into its correct position with his nose. The ship stopped turning. It stopped turning so abruptly, Rimmer had run halfway up the oncoming wall, and Lister and the cat were yanked from the safety of their stanchions and sent crashing to the floor. Crichton heard the unmistakable sickening sound of bones snapping against metal. Dangling from the gyroscope housing in the sudden silence, he looked down at the still bodies. Though he dreaded the answer, he asked the question anyway. "Is everyone all right?" "I'm fine, thank God," Rimmer panted, flat on his back. There was no reply from the cat and Lister. Crichton contemplated letting go, but the drop would almost certainly compound his injuries beyond the point where his auto-repair system could cope. Irreparably damaged, he could be of no use to either of them. He looked up at his hands above his head, and then towards the gantry opposite. If he judged his leap correctly, he might be able to trapeze over there and clamber down. He began to swing his legs back and forth. Suddenly, he heard an unearthly sigh. He looked down towards the bulging hull wall. It was beginning to split. Another inhuman sigh, and the breach in the hull grinned wider. Oxygen hissed out through the gap, freezing into a beautiful fragmented ice cloud as it hit the terrible cold of space. Crichton pendulumed to and fro, helpless with terror. Lister began to stir. He slithered from under the insensible cat and began to crawl towards the hole. This was the antithesis of the optimum course of action. Fleeing the engine room and sealing it off was their one small hope of survival. Crichton was about to yell at him to stop, to run for the stairs as fast as his injuries would allow, when he realized the situation was even more hideously lethal than he could have dreamed. Lister had not regained consciousness. He wasn't crawling in the direction of the wheezing gap. His body was being sucked towards it.